Greetings, friends. So I finished reading this book, 1917, Lenin, Wilson, and the Birth of the New World Disorder by Arthur Herman. Good book, good read, not boring at all. Who was Wilson? Who was Lenin? Woodrow Wilson was the President of the United States for 2 terms. He came to the presidency before the war began. In April of 1917, he took the United States into the war. Although he had previously ran on his re-election campaign, his motto was, "He kept us out of the war." So he was very adamant that the United States not get involved in World War I. But of course, he changed his mind. Vladimir Lenin, that's not his full name, but that's the name he came to be known as, was Russian. He did have a bit of Jewish in him, not much. He was always associated with revolutionaries, with socialists, and he spent much of his life outside Russia living as an exile. He lived for many years in Switzerland. He lived for some years in London, England. He returned to Russia briefly during the 1905 rebellion, and then he had to leave again. He was the leader of the Bolsheviks, who eventually came to power. So the author, Arthur Herman, the reason he's calling the book Lenin, Wilson, and the Birth of the New World Disorder is he's showing the 2 men sharing similarities, although obviously they're very different in many ways, but he argues that they share some important similarities and that also their actions helped to bring about the chaos of the 20th century. The thing that the 2 men shared in common was their idealism. They were both influenced by Georg Wilhelm Hegel, the German philosopher of the early 19th century. Wilson was not influenced really by Marx. He read Hegel, though. And Hegel was big on this progression of history. History is always proceeding and resolving itself. It's like an inevitable force, this inevitable development, like he talked about the master-slave dialectic, that eventually it has to resolve itself, and history itself is this force that's unfolding. You can't stop it. You can act knowingly or unknowingly, but you must eventually submit to the will of history, which is an idea that Karl Marx picked up on. So Lenin was initially influenced heavily by Marx, unsurprisingly. He did later read Hegel, but that was already much later in life. For Wilson, he was all about democracy. Democracy must be spread around the world. We must make the whole world safe for democracy. And he was opposed to great power politics, which he associated with the old powers in Europe, Germany, France, England, etc. Lenin, on the other hand, wanted to spread communism around the world, or socialism, both with an appeal to the common man, to the workers, to the peasants. And of course, they were both stupid idiots. They were idiot men. What do their ideas actually mean in practice? The only thing that's real in politics and in geopolitics is power. So you can't be making these appeals to, we're just going to get it all worked out and things will be fine, without spelling out in concrete terms what that means in terms of power. Now, the author argues that in the end, Lenin was at least honest enough that he's going to use power to kill all of his opponents. Wilson never was willing to do that. He was never willing to confront that in order to impose yourself on the world, it means acting like a great power. That means getting your hands dirty, going to war, or annexing territory. The war was still raging in 1917. The reason that Wilson didn't want to get the United States into war is because he wanted to preserve America as the ideal arbiter, above the fracas, above the chaos, above the low morality of the great powers, which I guess that makes sense. Although it's not, you can't argue that America was always that way. It came into being with a lot of violence. They went to war with Mexico. They went to war against indigenous peoples. They went to war against each other, against the French, against the British. So So, I mean, America has always had lots of violence producing it. But it was, of course, seen as an escape from the tight circumstances of Europe. There more upward mobility in America, more space for economic advancement, social mobility, better nutrition in America than in Europe. A sense that you could leave your troubles behind in Europe and come to America, and it's a land of the free. But they keep, again, even back then, they're using this language, freedom and all this stuff, and like, what does that even mean when it comes down to it? It was a very vague terminology. Wilson made all these appeals to freedom, and he never really explained what he meant by that. Wilson's big thing was the League of Nations. It's weird. The book says that he doesn't get the League of Nations, that he was defeated eventually by his own arrogance, because Wilson was an extremely arrogant man. But then, of course, there was some version of the League of Nations created after World War I. So that's not something that's explained very well in this book. I guess what the author was saying is that the United States didn't ratify it. They didn't ratify signing on to the treaty the way Wilson had wanted. Wilson was the only one who really wanted it. I mean, there were other people on his side that wanted it, but none of the other really great powers wanted it. David Lloyd George of Britain, Georges Clemenceau of France, they were just going along with Wilson's plan. Wilson wanted this League of Nations, which of course was the predecessor to the United Nations, to be a council where you can all get together and talk out your problems, and we can all arrange things together, and therefore we won't have violence anymore. Hopelessly idealistic, a hopeless failure, but useful for globalists. Now, I mean, you could say the United Nations was the quote-unquote successful outcome of the League of Nations after 1945 or 1947, but you could also say that NATO was the more effective product of this sort of idea, which inevitably wasn't a great power military alliance. Wilson and Lenin both had a huge amount of stubbornness to them. They were tireless workers. They both suffered strokes near the end of their lives that, incapacitated them eventually. So Wilson was an academic his whole life. He was a professor. He came from a Presbyterian background. He was president of Princeton College in New Jersey for a number of years, during which time he made enemies needlessly because he wanted these new buildings to be designed a certain way, and other people disagreed with him. It was like a needless dispute, but he steamrolled ahead, and eventually he left that job to run for the presidency because people were encouraging him because he was a good orator. He came to the presidency, but then once the people who had been pushing him to run for presidency, once he got the job, he was like, okay, now I'm in charge. Now you answer to me. I don't answer to you anymore. So he sort of went off on his own, doing his own thing. The fact is, America was financing Great Britain and France. And then France was in turn financing Russia, because during World War I, it was France and Britain and later Italy and Russia. The big three were Russia, France, and Britain against Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and also the Ottoman Empire, which was collapsing. Russia was bankrupt, but it was getting credit from France, and a lot of this credit was coming from J.P. Morgan. So Wilson could have put a stop to this, because indirectly this is continuing the war, because Britain wouldn't be able to continue if they can't pay their soldiers and they can't purchase foodstuffs and purchase supplies. Not just the financial aid, but the shipping going from the United States to Britain for food, for supplies, all of that stuff. So in a way, America was already kind of in the war with they had one foot in the war indirectly, keeping up the Allies. Germany was getting more desperate, even though they were very successful in a military sense. They basically defeated Russia by 1917, and that encouraged the Russian Revolution, the first Russian Revolution in the summer of 1917, which enabled the Bolsheviks to take power a few months later. Because Germany was blockaded by Great Britain, they were having their own issues with running out of food, and there was some starvation going on in Germany. Britain, they're getting desperate. Germany wasn't exactly blockading England, but they had their submarine fleet, and submarines were a new weapon of warfare at that time. And that was already causing a lot of damage to shipping going to Britain. Later on in the war, the Germans unleashed what they called unrestricted submarine warfare, which could include sinking American ships, sinking any ship that was most likely bringing supplies to Britain. I mean, it made sense if you wanted to starve Britain and force them to the bargaining table, but it ended up backfiring because that was the thing that really forced Wilson to get into the war. The Lusitania sinking, that wasn't so important based on this book. I was watching a video by Devin Stack of Blackpilled where he says that the sinking of the Lusitania was planned. They knew it was probably going to get sunk. It was carrying munitions, but it got sunk early in the war and nothing happened for like 2 years. So I don't know what he was talking about in that video. The Lusitania did not bring the United States into the war. It was continued sinking of American shipping. Really, I don't know, Wilson probably was such a stubborn man that he probably would have stayed out of the war. But then he suddenly decided that if I can make the world safe for democracy by staying out of the war, I can also do it by getting into the war. He declared war in April 1917, but not many American troops made it over to actually fight the Germans until the very, very end of the war, late 1918. By that time, there were almost 1 million troops in France. America had never participated in such a big war like this, at least not since the Civil War. So it had to create a new army. It didn't have the bureaucratic machinery to mobilize for war. So that's another thing that Wilson got done. Wilson and Congress, under his influence, had a huge effect on America gearing up for war. They created the Committee of Public Information, which was effectively a propaganda ministry under a man named George Creel. And of course, they produced propaganda. They also conducted censorship, like socialist newspapers were encouraged by the government to shut down. Negative propaganda about the Germans, and this ended up producing a lot of backlash against German Americans, because there were a lot of German Americans in the United States at the time. Some of them were lynched. A while ago, when I was talking about FDR's New Deal and how that made government much, much bigger and got government much more involved in our daily lives, well, in Americans' daily lives. There were some important predecessor of this in Wilson's actions during the First World War, making government bigger, getting government involved in railways. Apparently, at one point, they were managing all the railway companies. They nationalized like the railways, most of them. They got heavily involved in agriculture. In August 1917, Congress passed the Food and Fuel Control Act, which authorized the government to set prices for wheat, cotton, pork, coal, and petroleum, and to license all large-scale food producers and food distributors. This gave rise to the Federal Fuel Administration, which set prices and the supply of coal and oil for the whole country. And they were trying to get civilians to cut back on the use of fuel. So the FFA, the Federal Fuel Administration, first introduced daylight savings time in 1918 in this effort to get people to use less fuel. I'm not sure how exactly that relates to daylight savings time. The Food and Fuel Control Act also gave rise to the Federal Food Administration, headed by Herbert Hoover, who would later become president, I believe. It regulated prices for practically every agricultural commodity. It controlled an elaborate licensing system that prevented the export of foodstuffs by private businesses. Hoover's administration forced wheat farmers to sell their product at a set price to a government-controlled corporation and worked to rein in speculation on food-related futures and commodity markets. So this suspension of market forces generally benefited the biggest and the most established agricultural interests and agricultural distributors at the expense of smaller businesses. It marked the emergence of big business and big government in an alliance. Under Wilson, there was also the introduction of Liberty bonds or Liberty loans as a means to get ordinary Americans to invest so the government could finance the war and to reduce their own consumption. So those are some of the predecessors of stuff that would be brought even more forward during the 30s under FDR and the New Deal. Let's talk about how the Bolsheviks actually came to power. They capitalized on the First World War, and they capitalized on revolution which had already brought down the Tsar. So there's no more monarchy in Russia after the summer of 1917. The Duma, or the provisional government, which I believe is in the Duma, they are mostly socialists. They're liberals. They're not conservatives. So the author thinks that, Russia could have been fine if the provisional government just stayed in power and the Bolsheviks were prevented from being in power. And he has a point, yeah, maybe, but it's still liberalism. The Bolsheviks capitalized on the fact that there was still a lot of unrest amongst soldiers. The Germans were still pressing into Russia. The Germans really whipped the Russians during this war. They were getting close to capturing the capital, which was St. Petersburg at the time. It wasn't Moscow. It was getting to be a desperate situation, and there wasn't food. People wanted food. People wanted land. They wanted to take land from people that did have land. They wanted an end to the war. So that's what the Bolsheviks promised. And they only delivered on one of those things, which was ending the war. But they came to power basically by a coup. They got their own soldiers together because a lot of the army was disaffected, especially Kronstadt Naval Base. Those sailors played a pivotal role of the First Red Army. And it was never an easy deal. There was plenty of division, plenty of enemies of the Bolsheviks. There were the Mensheviks. They weren't originally the minority in the Soviet. The Soviet was like a workers' Congress, I guess you could call it. But they were tactfully labeled the Mensheviks by the Bolsheviks, and the name stuck, even though they weren't originally the minority. And then there were the left socialists, the left liberals, left socialists. There were a few other left-leaning parties, factions. Then there were the cadets, were the only so-called conservative faction. And then there were the whites later on who wanted to bring back the Tsar. And the different generals fighting from different parts of Russia, from the south, from the east, to fight the Bolsheviks. In the middle of 1918, the Bolsheviks only controlled about half of Russia. Well, they almost lost. Obviously, they forced out the provisional government. Alexander Kerensky, the head of that government, he had to flee, or otherwise most of them would be executed or imprisoned. When Lenin's Bolsheviks came to power, even before they had firmly established themselves, they signed a peace treaty with Germany, which they had promised they were going to do. Their slogan was peace, land, and bread. So they signed this treaty with the Germans because Lenin knew that he probably wouldn't hold on to power if Germany was still fighting them, because they were soon going to be taking over the capital. And he probably needed the Germans. He needed their assistance. And he sold out any nationalist ideals. Like Russians, they wanted an end to the war, but they didn't exactly want to see the dissolution of the Russian Empire, because that's what ended up happening. They lost the Ukraine, Poland, the Baltic states. They had to give up a huge chunk of the Russian Empire in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Lenin was willing to do that just so he could hold on to power. The Allies could have carried the war forward and stopped the Bolsheviks, especially after they defeated the Germans or forced the Germans into an armistice. But they were actually sending troops into Russia before Germany surrendered. They were thinking, well, maybe we have to fight the Bolsheviks, maybe we have to fight the Germans. A very disunited agenda. That's one of the reasons the Allies couldn't get their act together and stop the Bolsheviks. But Wilson dropped the ball. He didn't initially see the Bolsheviks as a threat. He thought, oh, well, that's nice. I mean, they're for the common man. That's great. Maybe we can work with them. And not long after that, the Bolsheviks executed the Tsar. And once the Bolsheviks executed Tsar Nicholas II and his family, then no one wanted to deal with them diplomatically because they were viewed as brutes, and they were brutes. And actually, I forgot to mention this. Originally, the Bolsheviks, like in the early 1900s, let's say around 1905, 1910, they were a criminal organization. They robbed banks. There were a bunch of stooges, and Stalin was the head stooge of Lenin. He was a criminal. He was also a former seminary student, which was kind of weird, but not exactly an intellectual. See, Lenin was like a criminal. He was like a mafia boss, but he was also an intellectual who wrote articles for Pravda, which was the Bolshevik newspaper. And then they got Leon Trotsky, who was originally a Jew. Well, he was a Jew. He changed his name. His original name was Lev Davidovich Bronstein. There were a lot of Jews in the Bolshevik movement. He changed his name to Leon Trotsky to sound more Russian. But then he's this huge Marxist intellectual, was like the number 2 guy in the Bolshevik government next to Lenin. Trotsky was actually organizing the army. Apparently he had some success, even though he never really fought in the army himself. Lenin didn't live that much longer after he came to power. He was dead by 1924 because by the early 20s he starts getting these strokes. His health keeps declining. Stalin, his number 2 man, starts getting more and more power. Even before Lenin died, Lenin could see that, Stalin is getting too much power, but there was nothing he could do about it because he was too weak. Stalin even threatened Lenin's wife with a Cheka investigation. And Cheka was like the new secret police, because the Tsar had their secret police, but then when the Bolsheviks came to power, they created an even more terrible secret police. And then Stalin even gruesomely had Lenin's body embalmed so it could be displayed to the public forever. Yeah, there was some parallel with like Wilson. Even before he finished his presidency, he makes the decision to go to Europe to get involved in the peace conference in Paris in 1919. He gets these strokes. He can't even sign very well. He can't make a signature very well on his paper. He gets more, his arrogance gets even worse. He gets more combative, more defensive. He was always an arrogant man, but with his declining health, he came to rely more and more on his wife, Edith. Apparently, towards the end of his presidency, he was effectively incapacitated, and his wife, Edith, was actually running the presidency, but they kept it a secret. And actually, Lenin's wife was heavily involved too, and he relied on his wife for a lot of stuff too. Even though he's had many mistresses, she still stayed faithful to him. Here's the interesting thing about the story. I should have told this at the beginning. Germany, in 1917, they actually decided, let's help these Russian exiles, these political extremists, come back to Russia so that they sow chaos and help bring down the provisional government, which is still fighting the Germans, and then that'll take Russia out of the war. So they actually chartered a private train to transport Lenin and his wife and about 30 other political extremists. Most of them were Russians, some of them were Polish or whatever, from Switzerland through German territory up to Stockholm, Sweden, and then Finland, and then into St. Petersburg. The Germans specifically set Lenin loose in Russia, and their plan worked almost too well. But if they'd known that Lenin would become the leader of the Soviet Union and the sort of monster that the Soviet Union would have been, perhaps they would have just executed Lenin. But this was only the decision of a few men at the very top, chief of staff or one of those 2 guys making this decision very secretly. Wilson could have stopped Lenin when he had a chance. He had numerous chances to do something about it. The Russian Civil War turned out in the Bolsheviks' favor. They defeated the Whites, they defeated all these other factions, and they did so by brutality and by terror, more terror than ever occurred during the French Revolution. And they created basically a military dictatorship, which Stalin eventually assumed the control of. Just to say a bit about the war, obviously a very stupid war. Some people say, well, if Britain hadn't gotten involved in the war, then Germany would have taken over Europe, but then the European Union still took over Europe despite the war, so maybe they did have to support Belgium and France. But why would you support France when France has been the traditional enemy of Britain for like 2 centuries? 3 or even more than that. A lot of people make the argument that Germany was the instigator of the war, but then I read that other book, how Russia fell into the disaster of World War I, and the author in that book, he was saying that no, Germany didn't really want to get into the war. It was Austria-Hungary and Serbia, and Germany just sort of made the mistake of not keeping Austria-Hungary in check. And then once Austria-Hungary went to war with Serbia, they made the mistake of backing Austria, which brought Russia into the war, and then that was like a domino effect. But Russia didn't really want to go to war. Germany was probably more confident that they could get a good victory if they kept the United States out for long enough. But of course, once the United States got involved, it was only a matter of time. And that's why Germany was so eager to win as fast as they could, which they almost did. They almost defeated the British and the French on the Western Front. They were still launching offensives up until the very end of the war. But of course, they were bled dry completely. But when the armistice came, it's not November 11th, it was November 8th, and they said, we'll stop fighting by November 11th. Apparently, more men died combined on both sides in the 3 days after the November 8th armistice until November 11th, 11 a.m. More men died in that short span of time than died on both sides on D-Day in the Second World War. So a needless slaughter of men. Even at that time, it came as a huge shock to the German public. Like, what? Why are we signing an armistice? We've completely beaten Russia. We're deep in French territory. But of course, the food situation and the morale of the soldiers was starting to crack. So the generals realized we've expended ourselves as far as we can go. Now the United States are really starting to send more soldiers over. They could steamroll right into Germany. They could completely annex Germany. We don't want that to happen. Let's sign an armistice. And then later, the peace treaty, half a year later, was brutal. The peace treaty shrunk a lot of German territory, and it made a mockery of Wilson's 14 points. He was big on his idealistic 14 points. One of his points was self-determination for national peoples. Obviously, it didn't apply for the Germans' advantage. It applied in certain cases here and there. So Wilson's idealism obviously had to compromise in the end. Just like Lenin had to get support from capitalist America later to stay afloat. He had to draw on German engineers later on, and that shows how these idealists have to compromise in the end. Allow me to read a bit from the book regarding the peace negotiations in Paris in 1919, which were very disorganized, thanks in no part to Wilson not having any specific agenda to achieve what he wanted. On the Allied side, there were four main players, of course: Woodrow Wilson representing the US, David Lloyd George from Britain, Georges Clemenceau from France, and Vittorio Emanuele Orlando from Italy. The four men were distracted, they were overworked, and they found very little in common. They often weren't together as a foursome very often. Wilson had to return to the United States to preside over the reopening of Congress. Lloyd George returned often to London because of political crises there. Orlando was sometimes obliged to go home. And then on February 19th, an ultra-nationalist, Émile Cotin, shot Georges Clemenceau, leaving him severely wounded, which took him out of action for several weeks. And this was when some of the Supreme War Council's most important decisions were being made, including decisions on Russia. But despite this, there was common ground among the four Allied leaders. And there's no doubt that Wilson stood apart from the other men in his idealistic approach to world politics and his rejection of what he saw as an outdated concept of the balance of power. In fact, both Georges Clemenceau and David Lloyd George were far more sympathetic to Wilson's position than history books suggest. J.P. Morgan, I mentioned the U.S. financial leverage over France, Britain, Russia. They drop out of the war. They don't get into the U.S. debt trap. Britain and France, they're now in the U.S. debt trap. The U.S. emerges from the war. They're the only ones with a currency still founded on gold. And the US dollar replaced the pound sterling as the world reserve currency. Clemenceau understood that France still had to cooperate with the US. The same was pretty much true of Lloyd George. Right after the war, he spoke of squeezing the German orange, meaning insisting on financial reparations. Wilson also wanted to be really tough on Germany. Lloyd George was also responsible for maintaining, even after the armistice, the punitive British naval blockade, which kept Germany perpetually on the brink of starvation, even though the supposedly high-minded humanitarian liberal Wilson never objected to the blockade. By the way, Wilson was also a progressive. Yet once Britain's key requirement for peace, the internment of the German High Seas Fleet, was taken care of, Lloyd George was willing to take steps to salve the feelings of Germany. The same Germany that had sunk British merchant ships without mercy and terror-bombed London. Not just with bombers, but before that with Zeppelins, which were blimps, airships. Although it was nothing like the Blitz in 1940. It was Wilson and Wilson alone who was the source of the problems that haunted the peace conference, and afterward, the Treaty of Versailles. Like many high-minded people, Wilson, when faced with opposition that he considered evil, but which refused to yield to his arguments, felt no compunction about simply crossing his arms and refusing to play the game. Early on, for example, there was the issue of what to do about Germany's former colonies in Africa and the South Pacific. Australia wanted New Guinea. South Africa wanted former German Southwestern Africa, which is today Namibia. New Zealand was after former German Samoa. Wilson was shocked. He was opposed to any settlement that involved the annexation of Germany's former possessions, but he had no better idea of what should happen to these lands, especially those in Africa and Micronesia, where the assumption of the white man's burden still applied. Eventually, the Big Four arrived at the concept of the Mandate, passing stewardship of non-European territories to the great powers for a limited period. Mandates were largely a fiction. The distinction between mandate and colony, especially in highly colonized Africa, was meaningless. But the idea provided a fig leaf for Wilson's insistence that the Paris Conference not become the tool of European imperialism. France and Britain accepted Wilson's phony compromise. Australia, South Africa, and New Zealand did not accept this compromise. They rejected the notion of getting a mandate for the territories which they saw as necessary for protecting their national interests. In the case of southwestern Africa, adjoining territory, Wilson was horrified. A discussion of this issue with Australian Prime Minister William Hughes exploded into a heated argument. Hughes viewed Wilson with nothing short of contempt. When Wilson rose up in indignation as they discussed the issue of New Guinea and asked, "Am I to understand that if the whole civilized world asks Australia to agree to a mandate in respect of these islands, is Australia still prepared to defy the appeal of the whole civilized world?" Hughes's answer was prompt and forthright. "That's about the size of it, President Wilson." Prime Minister William Massey of New Zealand grunted his agreement. In the end, a compromise was struck. The mandates were split into three groups. Former Turkish colonies in the Middle East, which were judged close to running their own affairs, were A-class. Colonies in places such as Africa, where the mandate power would run things, were B-class, and C-class territories were those close to or adjoining the mandate powers, which would administer the areas and peoples living in them as their own national territory. It was this C-class into which Australia, South Africa, and New Zealand were judged to fall, so the issue went away. But the whole mandate system was clearly a face-saving farce, and in places such as the Middle East, where France received a mandate for Syria and Britain for Palestine, it sowed the seeds of much trouble later on. The First World War was tactically such a waste of life because all these men are going over the trenches and getting mown down by machine guns. It's a war that favors the defender because you have trenches and machine guns are new. Tanks were still a very new invention. Airplanes were a very new invention. They still couldn't change the balance. They didn't really find any solution to this problem during the war. It was just a war of attrition in the end. But it still took several years for generals to not learn their lesson. They kept sending thousands and thousands of men over the top just to be slaughtered. But yeah, in the end, J.P. Morgan, the U.S. financial leverage, backing up France and the UK. I mean, that even more than the American troops. But of course, the American troops, that was eventually important too. But just at the end, just as the Germans were running out of steam. And their submarine warfare almost forced the British to surrender. Not quite. Because the United States, specifically in the British, they figured out, let's sail our ships in convoys. Let's develop destroyers to protect the convoys rather than having single ships go it alone. And this significantly reduced the number of shipping losses. Germany lost a lot of their eastern territory, which was given to Poland, and then they lost a lot of their western territory, which became a demilitarized zone. They lost Alsace and Lorraine back to France. And by the way, also in the Ottoman Empire collapse, the Allies were going to support the Arabs, Arab independence, Lawrence of Arabia. Oh, actually, we're going to promise the Jews their home state in Israel, the Balfour Declaration. National self-determination for all peoples. Bad time in history. Bad. This is a time when women get the vote. No one ever forget that. Authors like this will say, oh, women getting the vote is, they think it's a good thing. Bad thing. Bad thing. Universal suffrage. Bad thing. And again, World War I, bringing mass numbers of men into war. That's an unusual thing. That hasn't happened for most history, and it doesn't happen now. Armies are relatively small now. The armies that went to fight in Iraq, relatively small proportion of the US population. But back then, World War I, World War II, huge numbers. Actually, the British lost way more men in World War I than they lost in World War II. But that sort of mass mobilization, that's an uncommon thing. But it's that time of mass everything. Socialism for the masses. Universal male suffrage. Universal female suffrage. Democracy is just a good thing, right? The Kaiser and the conservatives who are running Germany, they just really messed up. They made some really bad decisions. And I guess you could say the same about the guys running France and Britain. So they messed up big time and they paid the price.
This is where the modern era really takes off.
Oh. Hasta luego, amigos. Hasta luego, amigos.